I'm Adrienne Alpert, and welcome to Congressman Adam Schiff of Burbank, top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Good morning to you,
Good morning.
We have so many topics.
Yes, we
but
do.
While we are taping this, we have not heard any substance yet from the meeting between President Trump and President Putin and this official bilateral meeting at the G20 summit. What do you expect to hear from this? What were you listening for?
Well, I have to say I was discouraged that even going into the meeting, the president said that we still don't know whether the Russians were responsible, that nobody could be sure. In terms of the Russian hacking of our election, there is no doubt about that. And to go into that meeting with Putin saying in Europe we don't know, simply not true, but also a great gift to Vladimir Putin in the run-up to that meeting. And then, of course, as he went into the meeting, he said it was an honor to be with Mr. Putin. That's not really how I would describe meeting with someone who ordered the interference in our election, who ordered the invasion of his neighbor in Ukraine, and who has ordered the bombing of civilians in Syria. That doesn't seem like an honor to me. But we'll see what comes out of this. Of course, we won't know exactly what is said in the meeting. We'll have to rely on what the president's representatives say about it, what the president himself says about it. What will be more important, I think, to look at is what are the concrete results. Is there any different approach in Syria? Is there any greater willingness by our president to level the American people about the Russian interference in our affairs, or stand up to Russian interference in other places?
We'll go back to that first statement that you made about the questioning what 17 intelligence agencies have concluded is that it was Russia somehow involved in the hacking. I think you said, but to continue to propagate his own personal fiction at the country's expense when he talked about possibly other countries being involved in the hacking. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. The president said a couple things that ought to concern all Americans. The first is that, once again, he cast doubt on our intelligence agencies on whether Russia was involved. The only way we really prepare and protect ourselves from future Russian malevolent action in our elections is by telling the American people what they do, what they did, how do we need to defend ourselves, and building a consensus that no matter who it helps or who it hurts, if a foreign country intervenes in our affairs, we will all reject it. That is something the president is clearly not ready to do. The other thing is he brought up the Iraqi WMD as an illustration of the intelligence community getting it wrong. So here he is in Europe, meeting with our allies, meeting with our adversaries, and he is throwing doubt on our own intelligence gathering capability.
And another breach of protocol, openly critical of his predecessor, President Obama, when he said Obama knew about the hacking and because he thought Hillary was going to win, did nothing about it.
You know, it's probably the most polite term I can use is it's deeply ironic for this president, who still won't confront Russia over the hacking, to say my predecessor wasn't willing to confront Russia over the hacking. It really, you've got to require some acute mental gymnastics just to wrap yourself around that idea. But yes, he's very comfortable attacking John Podesta or attacking Barack Obama. He's very poor at taking any responsibility for his own actions.
Knowing what you know about Vladimir Putin, how prepared do you think he was going into this meeting?
Well, I'm sure that his staff did their very best to prepare him, but he has great difficulty remaining on topic, having the discipline to put forward the positions of the United States, and indeed I think he undercut himself even before the meeting. So I would hope that he stayed on script, but we really don't know. And
as far as Putin's preparedness for this meeting, he's said to be someone who goes over hours of notes before he goes into a meeting.
I think he's certainly well prepared and probably has very specific objectives that he wants to reach. And I'm sure that's exactly how he went into that meeting and what he sought to pursue. I hope the president had the same fixed purpose going into that meeting. Otherwise, we will walk out the lesser for the encounter. You
know, you have been described as President Trump's public prosecutor, the fact you were a federal prosecutor before entering into politics. Are you worried about the president squandering his credibility or U.S. credibility in some of these statements that he is making?
Absolutely. You could see in what European leaders said, some of our closest allies, about not being able to rely on the United States the way they used to, this coming from Angela Merkel, or one of our closest, most important partners. The fact that others, Macron in France, another great ally, the British, it's a liability to be seen with this president, too close to this president, shaking hands with this president. That's a real problem for us. Those images of our president pushing the Montenegrin president out of the way during his last European trip will haunt this presidency, because it paints a portrait of an arrogant America that's not willing to listen to others, that's willing to literally push people aside, other countries aside. That's not helpful. America first may be a great slogan at home, but when you're negotiating with friends and foes alike to start up a negotiation, let's say that you and I are U.S. and Germany, for me to say, okay, before we begin this negotiation, I just want you to know I come first. That's not a particularly useful strategy.
But that's also, though, the president answering to the electorate, which supports him, which does believe that America comes first at all costs.
You know, certainly every country puts their national security and national interests ahead of other countries. That's granted, you know, to be taken. But you don't go into meetings with others where you hope to accomplish some objective and essentially rub their face in the fact that you are going to only put your interest ahead. Ideally, you appeal to the common interest. And the common interest here is an international rules-based order that has been of tremendous benefit to the United States. Institutions like NATO and institutions like the United Nations, as vexing as can be, these institutions often are enormously helpful.
In the run-up to all of this, of course, there was a flurry of activity with intelligence hearings, the whole question of collusion, or what did, if not any kind of activity between the Trump campaign and the Russians happen, the House Intelligence, all the various investigations, plus special counsel Mueller now. Where does all that stand? Because it seems to be pretty quiet right now.
You know, we are in the process of interviewing lots of witnesses, both the House and Senate. I'm sure that Bob Mueller is doing the same thing. A lot of it is out of the public eye. What the public gets to see is when we do open hearings. And certainly there have been a number of very high-profile ones. The first hearing that we had with Director Comey, where he acknowledged for the first time that there was an investigation going on into associates of the Trump campaign. But most of the work is going to be done in closed session. It won't be visible to the public. I think it's very important for people to understand, though, what a different role Bob Mueller has from what we're doing in Congress. Bob Mueller's job is to figure out, should someone be prosecuted, who should be prosecuted, were U.S. laws violated. He may only speak through indictment. On the other hand, the Congress, our investigation, has to lay out to the country the whole panoply of what the Russians did and recommend what we ought to do in response. So it's a very different responsibility.
How are you going to get to the bottom of what the Russians did or didn't do?
We're going to have to be thorough. It's going to take time. There are a lot of people we need to interview. There are mountains of documents we need to go through. You know, some of it's going to be hard because the Russians don't want to cooperate with us, certainly. There are people here at home that don't want to cooperate with us. But we have the power of subpoena and we have the power of the public spotlight. So we can get to the bottom of this. Obviously, it's a challenge given how politically fraught it is, but it's a real obligation. All
right, we're going to take a break. Congressman, we're going to talk about health care when we come back. Following the meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin in real time, and we know that the meeting lasted 2 hours and 16 minutes and is now over, and we're waiting to hear any kind of substance that may have come out of it. We did hear a statement, though, that Russia is prepared to announce a ceasefire in southwest Syria as of today, Monday. Did that surprise you, or was that something that was coming anyway?
Well, I think we ought to wait and actually see what the Russians do. They've made a lot of commitments they haven't lived up to. But I can promise you this, if the Russians proposed or agreed to any kind of ceasefire, they think it's in their interest, which means they think it's in the interest of the Bashar al-Assad regime and the perpetuation of that regime. So we ought to, I think, treat any Russian offer with great skepticism. Obviously, we want to do everything we can to reduce and bring to an end the terrible loss of life in Syria. But we have to understand the Russians' interests are fundamentally different than ours. They want to prop up someone who is a war criminal, who has indiscriminately bombed and gassed his own people. That's not in our interest. I don't think it's in the long-term interest of a stable Syria. But certainly if there's a way that we can find common cause in fighting ISIS, something the Russians have shown little interest in, I would favor that. If there are ways to further coordinate so that we don't risk military confrontation, that would be valuable as well.
And then we've got Ukraine and Crimea to talk about, too, if we hear anything coming out of that.
Absolutely. I think the president ought to push hard to get Russia out of Ukraine, and that includes out of Crimea, to live up to the Minsk Accords, to stop efforts to destabilize and invade its neighbors. Whether the president is going to really do the hard work that's necessary remains to be seen, but that's the message I hope he delivered.
All right, let's talk about health care. And the latest tweet from the president when all that was sort of breaking up was, okay, if you can't repeal and replace, then how about just repealing? At the same time, independent studies showed that perhaps at the end of some period of time, under the new proposed plans, 22 million people could end up with no health care coverage at all. What do you hear could come out of this? At this point, negotiations have stopped.
Well, this is the shocking thing to me, and it shows, I think, just to the degree to which we have kind of lowered the bar of our expectations. The first plan that came out of the House would cause 23 million people to lose their health insurance. The Senate bill was considered an improvement because 22 million people would lose their health insurance. If they reach some compromise within the GOP in the Senate, maybe we'll get lucky and maybe only 20 million people will lose their health insurance. Why should we even be considering legislation that would mean tens of millions of people lose access to health care? There are things that we can do to improve the current system to actually expand even more, even though we're at the lowest rates of uninsured right now, but that can further constrain costs. We're not doing any of that yet because we're still fighting about repeal. So I would hope that that idea will be abandoned and that we can move on to something far more constructive, which is how do we improve the current system?
It seems unlikely there is going to be any compromise. Where do you see this ending up?
Well, I'll tell you where I hope it ends up, and I can't say that we'll get there, is if the Republicans in the Senate aren't able to come up with a bill, or they come up with a bill but they can't get the House Tea Party people on board and therefore they can't move that, then the Republicans may have to do what Mitch McConnell has suggested, and that is actually work with Democrats, work on a bipartisan set of solutions to improve access to health care. I would welcome that. I think most people would welcome that, getting the parties working together. That hasn't happened because for 7 years one party has simply wanted to repeal and really didn't have a replacement in mind, even though they promised that they did. So I hope we can get to the point where if this does fail, we can move forward with something positive.
Well, let's see where that ends up. Let's talk about a couple of things closer to our home here, at least the state of California. Do you think President Trump is snubbing California? Certainly, look at here's 39 million residents. By 4 million votes here, usually within 6 months. Most presidents in modern times have been to California to visit. He hasn't been here. Do you expect to see him anytime?
You know, I certainly expect at some point he'll come to California, but the history of this presidency, the 6 months of this presidency, have been very atypical in many ways, but in one way in particular, and that is most presidents make some effort after the election to reach out to those who did not support them. This president has never done that. He has gone to hold rallies in the places that voted for him and really not made an effort to reach out either to Democrats but also to parts of the country that didn't support him. And I hope that changes. Well,
he has also made a great allegation of election fraud, notably California, and has now an election commission. Now there's a lawsuit starting, I guess, in New Hampshire about trying to give the election commission the information that it wants on all voter registration. And that pushback is beginning. Do you think that California, well, we've had Alex Padilla just recently on this program saying that he's not going to be cooperating either.
And there's no reason to. I mean, this is, you know, like many bad things that have happened the last 6 months. It starts with a tweet. The president claims that millions of people illegally voted, undocumented immigrants. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. But in order to buttress that claim, he establishes a commission. I think the real agenda of the commission is to try to make a case for further voter disenfranchisement, pass more strict voter ID laws that will mean that people who are elderly, that don't have an identification, or minority voters that, if they can put up enough obstacles, can't get to the polls. That looks like the agenda. So why should California go along with that agenda? We shouldn't. Why should we provide information that could make voters vulnerable in terms of their Social Security numbers? we shouldn't, and I think that California and other states are making exactly the right decision.
All right, we have to take another break. We'll have some more questions right after we come back. Congressman Adam Schiff, let's talk about California and its efforts to become a sanctuary state, a process still going on in Sacramento, although on this program, Senate President De Leon said that he's calling it the California Values Act and not sanctuary state, but still it calls for a certain non-cooperation with immigration officials. And what the president and the administration has said, that could cost California dearly in federal funding. You support this measure if California goes through?
I do. I support the action that the cities have taken and the state if it decides to take that action as well. There are, I think, a lot of good reasons for us not to turn our police officers into agents of immigration. It means the community won't turn to them to report crime. It'll affect, I think, the trust level. But everyone understands we need comprehensive immigration reform. Ultimately, we're going to get comprehensive immigration reform. So why should we be splitting up families and devastating kids? It just doesn't make much sense to me. So I think we ought to protect people that are here and do so humanely as we work to solve this problem rationally and in a comprehensive and a fair way.
The sheriff on this program has also said, though, that it's not that he's not trying to cooperate countywide, but more in the jails, in turning over criminals to ICE so that they go back out into the community. Do you see that there could be some compromise in this?
You know, there's certainly area for compromise, and I don't think anyone wants to see any violent criminals, immigrants or non-immigrants, released back on the street. And, you know, there have been some very tragic cases where people were deported and came back in and had serious records and went on to commit terrible offenses. By and large, though, when you look at it, immigrants are less likely to commit a violent crime than people that are born here. I don't know what that says about society these days. But I don't want to see us villainize all immigrant communities because of these horrendous acts of some.
A couple quick looks at some other things about funding. You've sent a letter of concern to the Forest Service over contract changes to firefighting helicopters. We're coming into what could be a horrific fire season with all the brush that's grown over this wet season. What's going to be happening to our firefighting efforts?
Well, this is a great concern to me. The Forest Service is changing the contracts with a number of the helicopters that are used by firefighters to put down these flames, and obviously we catch them early, we can avoid potential loss of life, a lot of property damage. And so I've written to the Forest Service to say, you know, essentially, what are you doing? And does this mean that those helicopters may not be available when we need them? We fought for years to get the Forest Service to revise a policy it had against doing nighttime drops. We finally got that reversed. If you can get there quickly, whether it's at night or during the day, it can make all the difference. So I've yet to hear back from the Forest Service, but it is a grave concern because, like you say, this could be an awful fire season.
This means, though, that there might not be a helicopter available at a moment's notice. It wouldn't be stationed somewhere closer to us. They move them around? Exactly
the concern, that we may go from the exclusive opportunity to use these when we need them to, well, we'll share them with others, and we'll hope that we can get them when we need them.
Let's talk about federal funding for the earthquake early warning system, which is partially in place. LA says it's going to have its own in place, I believe, within the year. But for statewide, where that 2 to 3 minutes could stop a train, stop an elevator, it was red penciled, I guess, in the president's budget. Can Congress put that back?
Yes, and I think we will. And people should realize, when we started this effort, and I made the first proposal in Congress to fund it, it wasn't in President Obama's budget either. We had to put it in a couple of years before we sold the administration on the idea, but then they fully embraced it and they would put it in their own budget. We have a new president. He has zeroed it out, but I'm confident on a bipartisan basis we can restore the funding. It makes even less sense now that the system has been significantly built out to stop before we can operate it. And it should go the entire length of the West Coast of the country. Other countries have employed this. It's not like it's a speculative technology. It works. It saves lives. And whether you can stop an elevator or a surgery or just get to a safe place, that little bit of notice could make a lot of difference.
All right, in our final minute, let's talk politics, pure and simple. Chris Matthews, MSNBC, says you're on a list as a potential candidate for president in 2020. Are you?
Well, it was flattering to be on a list or mentioned that way. No, I'm not running for president. Running for re-election, and happy to do that. But no, I was flattered to be thought of that way.
All right, you're running for re-election, but Senator Dianne Feinstein is still flirting with the idea of running again for another term or not running. Would you be interested in becoming a United States Senator should she decide not to run for re-election?
You know, I hope she'll run again. I think she's a terrific senator. If she decided for whatever reason not to, that is certainly something I would look at very seriously.
Well, they, I think, had a poll that said that while most think that perhaps it is time for her to retire, should she decide to run again, they would vote for her.
She's done a phenomenal job. She has, and she's been my counterpart for many years on the Senate Intelligence Committee. She plays the most important role on the Senate Judiciary Committee now, and is a real powerhouse. And she's done a phenomenal amount for the state as well as the country.
All right. For the record, for this time, though, you are running for re-election.
Yes.
All right, Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you for joining us.